Reframing here, and I hope you're all well. Now, today I want to talk about Alfred Kinsey, because I think there's a problem with Kinsey. So we'll call this podcast The Problem with Kinsey. What would that problem be? Well, let's start by looking a little bit about who Alfred Kinsey was. Alfred Kinsey is known as probably the most seminal American sex researcher of the middle of the 20th century. He was, in fact, an etymologist. He spent most of his career studying fruit flies, and he had amassed an absolutely enormous collection of these and had studied the variations and the subtle changes that appeared in the morphs as you went from place to place and within particular areas. He looked at different environments, and he studied all that, and he mapped it all out. And he applied the same reasoning to human sexuality when he came to look at it. There's nothing wrong with that. Any biologist would normally assume that there will be a scale of variation in any organism that he's looking at. That's because biology always does show variation. Simple as that. If you take a look at, say, an oak tree, and remember this is a single organism, so it's all the same DNA, yet every leaf will be slightly different. There will be big ones and small ones, and they will all be different. That's variation. And variation between individuals of the species is much, much greater, and especially if that species reproduces by sexual reproduction, because that introduces a lot more variation. So it was quite normal and understandable for Kinsey to use this model, and so he developed his scale, his famous Kinsey scale of male sexuality, which went from 0, which was completely heterosexual, with absolutely no interest or experience of homosexuality at all, up to 6, which was completely homosexual, with no experience or desire of a heterosexual nature whatsoever. So far, so good. He looked at this as a range of variation. Now, there's a big problem with this, because if you look at a scale like that, a biological scale like that, and they exist everywhere, that's why Kinsey used it, then if you apply a standard distribution to that, then you would expect the vast majority of results to fall in the center. This is the famous bell curve, which I'm sure you've all seen. If you apply the bell curve to Kinsey, it would predict that most people would actually be somewhere in about a 3 or a 4, 2, 3, 4, 3 being the highest one, and that is not what happens. That is not what Kinsey found. The bell curve the model he used would predict something that was not supported by the evidence, right? When that happens, you have to look at the model. You have to say, there's something wrong with the way that this has been set up. And I'm afraid what that should tell us is that there's something wrong with the way Kinsey set up his model. If Kinsey had been right, if that model had been right, nearly everybody in the male sex, which was what he was originally studying, he later did a similar study of females. In the male sex, he would find that most males were bisexual. And completely bisexual. They would be equally attracted to males as they are to females, and all the rest of it. And that's simply not the case. Kinsey's own results tell you that that's not the case. If what is called true bisexualism does exist, and I am dubious, but if it does exist, then it only exists in a very small number of people. As has often been said, gay, straight, or lying. That's actually the truth. People are either homosexual or heterosexual, with maybe possibly a tiny number of actual bisexuals in there. Amongst males. It's very different in females. That's not what we're talking about here. We're not talking about females, so get that out of your heads. We're talking about males. So how did it happen that Alfred Kinsey, who was, an incredibly good researcher, just was amazingly thorough and very, very, very erudite man, a man who was very well educated and really understood his subject. How could he make an error like that? And I think the answer is, I've been thinking about this a while because it's been troubling me. It's been one of these things that's kept me awake at nights going, There's something about that I just don't like. I just can't make it work. And it's because of this standard distribution, because the bell curve doesn't fit the Kinsey model. It doesn't fit. Kinsey's own stats, they don't match it. Observation doesn't match it. If anything, it's an inverse bell. with a really heavy preponderance of heterosexual males at one end, and a smaller number of homosexual males at the other end, and almost no bisexuals in the middle, which is just so unlikely in statistical terms that it must make you think about the model. And I think Kinsey got it wrong. Here's why. I think that Kinsey started off by thinking that everybody was a fruit fly, if you know what I mean. What he didn't allow for was that there is a significant difference between males and females, a really fundamental one. And, you know, we're talking about the 20th century here, where it was becoming popular to believe that, you know, males and females are just the same, really, all the same. It's just, you know, they're equivalent. And actually, they're not. They simply are not. And this is a really good demonstration of the fact that they're not. And we can look at why. What should actually happen is that we should look at males and females as being two completely separate things, right? They're just not the same. Why would it be so unlikely that people would be bisexual? Well, the answer is some people we know have a thing called sexual inversion, which means that due to anomalies either in utero hormone delivery or in the way that their androgen receptors work within their own bodies, or both, they don't masculinize. These are males with female traits. I don't mean feminine traits, female traits. They have female sexuality. They want to be penetrated by men. They desire men sexually. And they're often highly feminized. That is, they look like girls. I have acquaintances who are actually ladyboys, but who don't take hormones, and they're just unbelievably feminine. You couldn't possibly believe that these were actually males. You would never call them men. I mean, okay, so they wear their hair long and they wear makeup and they dress pretty, but there's just no way, looking at them, that you would think, aha, that's a man in a dress. These people are so feminized, and they're so feminized naturally. So straight away we've got this sort of two things. We don't have, you know, a continuum between the heterosexual male at one end and the homosexual male at the other end. What we've got is a standard and something that is a deviation from the standard, which would be the sixes, or as Ray Blanchard puts it when he talks about transsexuals, he would say they were a 7 or an 8, which I would agree with, by the way. So what you have is a situation where there are two peaks, because you have people with male sexuality at one end, who are the 0 to 1s, right? And always bear in mind that men will penetrate anything. You know, if there isn't a woman handy, they'll penetrate a boy, they'll penetrate a goat, they'll penetrate a horse, they'll penetrate anything. If they just want some sex, that's what they'll do. So you can't take that as being, you know, your standard. That's not about attraction, that's just about getting some sex. So you've got males with male sexuality at one end, and then that's their main spike. And then at the other end of the scale, you've got this other spike, the second one, which is smaller, much, much smaller, but still is more than the middle areas, the 2, 3, 4, 5, which is the sexual inverts, which are what Kinsey called homosexual males. And I think this is actually a more intelligent model. It works better because it actually does fit the stats. Kinsey found, if you analyse Kinsey's data, you find that a relatively small number of people had what he would describe as homosexual feelings or experiences. Very small numbers. The numbers of bisexuals were tiny. And we've always found that in observation. Bisexuals are actually very hard to find. You know, I mean, there's lots of cultural bisexuals. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about people who really are equally attracted both to male and female bodies, masculine and feminine bodies, and they're also equally attracted to the idea of penetrating as of being penetrated. These individuals are extremely rare. You know, they are very, very rare. And they're right in the middle of the Kinsey scale. So it completely bucks the standard distribution. It blows the bell curve right out of the water. So what I'm saying is that something happens to males, which makes them men. And that categorically and definitively makes them different from females, okay? and except for some males, don't have that. So they remain more like females. They have female sexuality. Those are your sexual inverts. So I think at the end of the day, we have to look at Kinsey and take it with a pinch of salt. It was very valuable work at the time. And remember, there was always a political imperative to Kinsey, because he was living in an extremely repressive society, the United States at the time. And he wanted to change that. I'm not saying that politics entered his thinking. I would never impute that to a scientist of his standing. I don't think he did. But the way his work was interpreted by others particularly, was definitely quite political in nature. I think that we need to step back from this. We need to recognize, first of all, that males and females are actually different. They're different in morphology, they're different in sexuality, they're different in everything. Right? They are actually different. They are not the same. There may be certain equivalencies, but they're just not equal. They're not the same. Male does not equal female. They are two completely different morphs of one species. They are not the same. And what we're talking about when we're looking at male sexuality is males who have standard male sexuality, which is what I have, most men have, and then some males who for some reason don't, and they have a female sexuality. And it does appear to be that this has to do with the application of testosterone throughout the period that they're at their youngest. And it actually persists all their lives, so we have to assume that there's something going on within their own bodies that prevents testosterone from masculinizing them. If you're British, you might remember recently a TV presenter called Philip Schofield, and he came out at the age of 50-odd, having married, having had kids, said, "Oh no, I'm actually gay. I'm gay. I'm coming out as gay." I think any man who had looked at that person over the previous 20 years of his career would have said, "That's a girl. That's not a man. That's a woman." He's incredibly feminine in appearance. And it wasn't a surprise to anybody that I know that he suddenly came out as being, "Oh, I'm gay." It wasn't a surprise at all. It does look as if this model is correct, that you have this large number of males who are standard format. That's the way they are. They're attracted to femininity. They like to penetrate. But you also have a group who, for some reason, and it must, I think, have to do with testosterone not being able to do what it normally does for two potential reasons. And these males have female sexuality, are shifted towards the feminine, and generally speaking, just aren't masculine. And the thing is that there is a scale of variation going on in here, but it's not from homosexual to heterosexual. What's happening is that within the sexually inverted group, there is a scale from completely sexually inverted through partially sexually inverted to basically not sexually inverted, right? So that you get people who are maybe slightly bi-curious, slightly gay-curious, rather, males who are homosexual but they don't have transition desire, right through to the completed one, the complete sexual inverts who live as women and are normally known as HSTS, homosexual transsexuals. And maybe we would find a small number of genuine bisexuals right at the point where that scale begins to ramp up, at the very beginning, a zero of that scale, if you like. But that's not zero on the Kinsey scale. These people are all 5s or 6s on Kinsey, okay? They're not zeros. But if we developed a new scale, which was only of sexual inversion, these people would be maybe a 0. And they would be perhaps, maybe bi-curious, maybe gay-curious. We don't really know, because nobody studied it this way before. There's my thoughts on that. Kinsey was one of the most important researchers in the United States in this field of the 20th century. He certainly legitimized sexology as a research field in the United States. I don't think he got this right. I think he made a fundamental mistake by trying to put homosexuality and heterosexuality at opposite ends of the same scale. I don't think they're on the same scale. I think they're completely different phenomena, and they can't be measured in that way. So that's it for today, for that. Thank you.